afternoon, everybody. Mine is something of a cautionary tale, so hold any expectations of high end sort of technology. It's the evolution of a blended learning and things that I learned along the way. So firstly, I'm going to place the unit, or place my presentation in some context, is something about the unit, my undergraduate unit, which is Negotiation, Bargaining and Advocacy, which has, since 2003, had blended components within it. Something of the barriers that I encountered, quite surprisingly, in that unit after some period, and the way in which I'm using the collaborative learning spaces that are on level 3 of building DB to try and remedy that problem, to try and support the blended learning strategies in that particular unit, which has required some particular reorientation on my part as well. So the original evolution of the blended learning strategy in negotiation, bargaining and advocacy was that it went from a unit that was taught in intensive mode with 30 students to a required unit with over 200 students offered both campuses, both Parramatta and Campbelltown, and day and evening mode. So the ability to have some face-to-face negotiations, video face-to-face negotiations, have them ongoing across the intense mode was no longer available to us. We had to think of another way in which we could develop some experiential learning in negotiation, and plus link it to assessment in some form of meaningful way. And some way where I, as unit coordinator, could monitor this across the different cohorts and the different sort of campuses. So there were many design considerations which I think you'll appreciate once you see the site. So in part we set up an assessment where students would either be in a management or union group. We have a context with a lot of contextual market. So this year it happens to be a credit union workplace, and they have 9 weeks to negotiate 4 outstanding items in an enterprise bargaining agreement. And that's specified, and there's lots of resources in the marketplace. There's not too much context that the students have to develop. They have to reach agreement, which is a little counter-jurisdictional, but they have to reach agreement. So there's a maximum of 4 students in each management group, and a maximum of 4 in each union group. So I have 30, presently, just to give you a 2013 example, I have 31 sets of negotiations at the moment, okay, involving what's roughly, the unit tends to oscillate between 220, 250 students. So I have those sets of negotiations proceeding. In terms of the platform to support the blended learning strategy, and just as a precursor to that, students don't attend face-to-face every week. They have 2 weeks where they're not required for face-to-face classrooms, and some weeks where the other teaching space is modified in response to the type of learning that they need to engage in to complete the negotiations. So we currently use the Views discussion board to conduct the negotiations, and we've used previous iterations of Blackboard in the past. Each management group and each union group has their own discussion board, and no other students can lock into that. And each opposed negotiation has its own discussion board. So there are 93 discussion boards in operation in this unit. The beauty of the discussion board is that it enables transcript of the negotiation to be maintained, which is a great thing because ultimately the record of the negotiation is assessed by the students, and it doesn't require that the students are all online at the same time, although sometimes they are. So it can be both synchronous and asynchronous. Now I'll just show you what that sort of looks like in practice. We'll just go here. So we just go straight to the, so you can see all the discussion boards are set up, And the posts are the number of messages that each group has posted. Now, you can see even with all of our efforts that students engage in the exercise in a very sort of different way, although sometimes their messages can be very long, sometimes it can just be yep, or something along those lines, something profound like that. Sometimes they use multiple forums, sometimes they use attachments. So the number of messages isn't necessarily a useful means, although as you can see with Union 19 I just failed really. But so some students absolutely enter into this boots and all and really engage with the type of learning that I'm wanting them to take from the unit. So if we can see just when we look at what happens within the forums, within each of the forums, some students set up different threads. I don't worry about how they use the discussion board, just that they sort of negotiate, so you just slide that over there. So there's multiple threads, as you can see, by all different students in the group, and the technology required is really just like an email type technology, so it's quite familiar to them. They can engage in Facebook, but as long as they paste it in, I have to see it on this particular site. So that's in broad terms, and clearly they can do that at any time. They certainly don't need to be on campus to engage in that work. When the assessment was originally designed, individual students had to write a critique where they assessed what occurred in the negotiation against particular models of how, both descriptive and normative, of how negotiation, what we understand from the research about how negotiations usually proceed. And that critique was worth 50% of their grade, and then there was an examination. At that stage, there was no assessment of their negotiation skill, nor the resultant agreement, because that was their learning. Nor there was any assessment of really the group engagement in the consultation or the group cohesion. And part of my method there, or my rationale, was that I didn't want students to be concerned or frightened about engaging. Okay, I didn't want them to have a barrier to make them think that I was looking at the quality of the post. I wanted them to learn by mistake, particularly in negotiation. Can be a very frustrating experience, and I wanted them to learn something of that from that particular frustration. And to a certain extent, students did enjoy the fact that the unit was different, that they weren't coming face to face, that they could engage in this particular way. Something that I'm sure you'll all understand, it required a lot of effort on the part of the unit coordinator in terms of monitoring, setting up, maintaining, resourcing, supporting. Around 2010, and Rosemary Thompson was sort of a great counsel to me, I was having sort of particular issue just every year that I ran the unit with not a large number of groups, if you like, if I can pinpoint the Union 19 issue I was encountering. And apart from my sort of care for the students in Union 19 as to why they weren't engaging in all of those issues, my critical concern was with the group against whom they were opposed, because through no fault of their own, Management 19 is disadvantaged because they're in an exercise with another group who despite all sorts of encouragement, meetings, consultations, do not want to engage. So, and I just felt the students were pulling away from the unit. It had lost its lustre, and while education professionals loved the design of the exercise, the students were perhaps ambivalent about the exercise. SFUs were flattening. My own just sort of intuitive sense about the student engagement was that it was flattening. And so I needed to think of something about how to engage in the groups and how to mediate the impact of the disaffected groups and how to do that in an environment where I didn't see all of the students all of the time. You know, how to really almost physically engage the student. So we allocated some part of the assessment, it had to be said grudgingly on my part, to a group cohesion, group engagement type assessment. So looking at their research, looking at their responsiveness on the VUE site, looking at the way in which they work together to develop strategy, and looking at whether they produced an agreement. So in no way looking necessarily at the quality or sophistication of their strategy, because of course we have part-time students who are perhaps already doing this in some professional capacity. So I was mindful of that. In terms of the face-to-face learning time that I now have, I now use this far more significantly. I allocate far more of that time now to the groups taking control of that group space. So in the collaborative learning spaces up on the third floor of Building EB, we have round tables where groups can they immediately cohere. They enter into the room and they're assembled in their groups by 3 minutes past the hour of when teaching's meant to start. We have whiteboards right around the room. We have the ability to use whiteboards at the end of the room, and we have a fixed console with the ability to access views in a very sort of immediate space within that particular room. And I now allow within that particular space, I allow 5 to 10 minutes at the start of class for groups to actively strategise and plan at the beginning. I enable that space, and with clearly with me around, to assist in the development of that group engagement, particularly given the blended nature of the unit. Okay, so my face-to-face time with the students is particularly precious. And I need to utilise the resources sort of differently. So the type of, I guess, intensive content preparation I would normally use that tutorial space with the students to engage in, I now use in a more flagging and identifying type way. More on that in a moment. So the groups, just something as rudimentary as the groups having an amenable, an immediate space is fantastic. And I have tutorials this year which don't use those spaces, and there is clearly a difference. So there's allocated time to plan, some open reporting and indicator sort of settings. So I get the groups to self-report to me in using that particular space. The views resources are very easily accessible, even visually within those particular spaces, so much different from a lecture theatre. And I think we need to recognise that there are lots of discontinuities in what technology students bring to class. So I have students who don't download any resources, whether in e-form or print form, and I have students who either download and print and bring printed resources to class, and students who have some form of tablet technology or look at their views site on their phones. So you have all of those types of readiness in your particular classroom. And I guess you can make a decision, well, for the students who don't prepare, don't bring their class, well, you know, that's their problem, but it's disruptive to the rest of the class. So in terms of bringing the views material immediately on the screen, so students of course can use their iPads if they have an iPad or a tab or a PC, and have that more immediately available to them. But at least you've got something that's intimate that you're able to work with around. And then I will present the flagged type content that we perhaps would have studied in a very different way or worked with. I do in more bite-sized chunks within this space, and then I enable the groups to reflect on the material, identify its importance for their online group negotiation, and build it into their portfolio of what they have to do for the next particular week. Done. The intimacy of the room assists the use of the resources that have been placed on views, because technically, of course, I could share all of that in the Parramatta Day lecture, which is the big, but it's different for me to, that immediacy of working with groups and knowing that the significant, I guess, engagement issue with this unit is particularly getting the groups engaged in the exercise, getting the groups negotiating in the online negotiation so that ultimately they produce a record of the negotiation that they can critique. In that particular space, this is a useful device for me to work around with groups, because clearly I can bring up their progress on the mobile app site and look with them within the individual groups about how they're proceeding. And so rather than trailing laptops and whatnot, this has been a useful device, a very useful device within that particular site. The group's comfort with using the whiteboards around the room tends to vary. I quite like them to chart their progress almost by drawing their progress between sort of competitive and cooperative behaviour, which is a particular theoretical sort of issue we need to deal with in this unit. And they're a little more reticent about sort of using those whiteboards, but where they do, it's a very useful way for the groups to sort of identify, almost to chart their own work by using the whiteboard space. Rooms will be even sort of further enhanced when all students have access to the iPad. So mine's a level 3 unit, so clearly not part of the rollout yet. And probably just a recognition that even with this type of unit, with its combination of both with its blended learning, remains incredibly resource intensive. Okay, so the resources that are required to support the online activity, and in part because I've used the collaborative learning space as a particular way of garnering group engagement, has meant that other resources and other topics and other themes that I would have explored in the tutorial space, I now deal with in a different way. And that's a particular challenge and remains a particular challenge. So it's the evolution. Rosemary and I don't quite know where it's going yet, but it's something of a problem child for me, but one in which I'm sort of determined to get a good outcome. So, thank you for your time.